April 1945. The rain had turned the camp roads into rivers of brown slush, and the air smelled of tin roofs and disinfectant. Under a sagging canvas awning, a young Japanese nurse barely 22, uniform faded to grey, sat cross-legged beside a ration crate stamped U.S. Army Field Supply. Her fingers shook as she peeled back a square of brown paper. Inside lay something she had only heard of: chocolate. The American guard stood a few meters away, his boots slick with mud, watching quietly. Around her, other prisoners whispered, half fear, half disbelief. She broke off a piece the size of her thumbnail, hesitated, then placed it on her tongue. It melted almost instantly. The sweetness hit like lightning. It wasn't just sugar. It was everything forbidden, everything lost. For months, these women had lived on watery rice and boiled roots. The imperial rations that once promised honor now tasted of iron and desperation. But this was warmth, calories, mercy disguised as flavor. Her body didn't know how to react. Some prisoners giggled nervously. Others wept. A Red Cross record later noted that American soldiers received about 4 ounces of chocolate daily, mostly Hershey bars designed to boost morale. To a half-starved nurse from the collapsing empire, that number was unthinkable. 4 ounces a day was luxury beyond class, beyond conquest. She looked at the wrapper, tracing the embossed letters as if reading scripture. The guard, seeing her eyes widen, gave a small nod. No words, just the silent permission to eat. That nod broke something deep inside her, the certainty that Americans were monsters. It was sweet, too kind for war. She would later write in her repatriation diary. In that instant, the propaganda dissolved faster than the chocolate itself. She could still hear the rain, smell the gun oil, feel the waxy paper soften in her hand. Every sense anchored her to this strange reality. The enemy had fed her. As night fell, thunder rolled over the camp. She wrapped the leftover square carefully in cloth, saving it for later, though she didn't know when later might come. Hunger was familiar, kindness was not. The sweetness lingered on her lips as her stomach tightened again, reminding her what hunger once felt like, and what it could never mean the same way again. The next morning smelled like something she had forgotten existed: bread. The camp kitchen hissed with steam as American cooks stirred vats of oatmeal and opened crates stamped with brands she couldn't read: Hershey, Kellogg, Heinz. To her, they looked like strange relics from another civilization, one that never knew scarcity. She thought back to 1944, when every meal in her field hospital was an act of calculation. Rice was measured by spoonfuls, salt traded like gold. They had boiled grass for tea, scraped rust from cans to make them usable again. Their imperial rations arrived late and light, the paper labels bleeding from rain and seawater. Now she stood in line watching boxes of food, unloaded from the back of a truck, crates of canned meat, powdered eggs, and chocolate stacked higher than her shoulders. The contrast burned deeper than hunger ever did. Reports show that Japanese front-line soldiers often survived on less than 600 calories per day, while their American counterparts consumed over 4,000, complete with dessert and gum. In the Pacific's humid heat, that difference wasn't just comfort, it was survival. She noticed how casually the Americans ate. A soldier leaned against a jeep, chewing gum like it was oxygen. Another tossed half a biscuit to a stray dog. The waste made her jaw tighten. Yet beneath the shock was envy. How could an enemy feed its troops this well while her comrades died of malnutrition? She remembered ration charts issued by the Imperial Army, full of slogans about sacrifice and purity. They had believed endurance was strength, but looking at the Americans, she saw another kind of strength, one built from abundance, not deprivation. That night, she found herself whispering to another nurse, wondering aloud if perhaps power didn't come from dying hungry for your emperor, but from never having to starve in the first place. Her friend stared at her, horrified. "Don't say that," she hissed. "Someone will hear." But someone had already heard the guard from the chocolate day, leaning quietly at the fence, pretending not to understand their language. He looked away, but his faint smile told her he did. As she lay awake, the sound of engines rumbling outside reminded her that this abundance came from somewhere: ships, factories, machines she had never seen. And the question burned deeper than hunger. How could any nation produce this much, this fast, in the middle of a war? The question of abundance was still echoing in her head when memory dragged her back to the day everything changed. Luzon, February 1945. The jungle had burned for a week straight. Smoke crawled over the ridgelines, and the sound of artillery never really stopped. It only paused to let the screams breathe. Her field unit had been trapped for 3 days, their medical tent shredded by shellfire, their stretchers abandoned on mud that smelled of blood and cordite. When the order finally came, a surrender, no one moved at first. Japanese soldiers weren't supposed to surrender. The code said die where you stand. But they were nurses, not fighters, and most of the men around them were already gone. So they tied strips of bandage into white flags and stepped into the open. The gunfire stopped. Then came silence, heavy, almost unreal. American soldiers emerged from the smoke, rifles raised but fingers still. The women froze, waiting for humiliation or death. Instead, the guards gestured toward water. One even shouted, "Doc, over here, they're medics." That single word, medics, cut through the noise like mercy. They were led to a clearing, their wounds cleaned with disinfectant that stung but didn't burn like hatred. One nurse flinched as a corporal wrapped her arm. The man just said, "Hold still, ma'am." The word ma'am hit harder than the shell that had torn her sleeve. Historical accounts estimate about 300 Japanese women, mostly nurses, were captured in the Philippines in 1945. Most expected beatings, interrogation, maybe execution. What they found instead were bandages, blankets, and something stranger: respect. Later that night, as they were transported to the POW camp, she pressed her forehead to the truck's wooden slats, watching American medics treat the wounded on both sides. The hypocrisy of her own military hit her. Japanese officers had shot men for surrendering. These enemies were healing theirs. In her journal, she later wrote, "We expected cruelty. We found clean bandages." The words weren't forgiveness, just confusion wrapped in disbelief. When dawn came, the truck stopped before a camp ringed with barbed wire and tents. A wooden sign read simply, "Allied Detention Medical Station." As she stepped down, the sharp scent of soap and antiseptic filled the air, an unfamiliar promise of cleanliness. And in that sterile scent, a new form of shame began to grow. The scent of antiseptic didn't fade. It followed her into the camp like a ghost. Steam hissed from a long wooden shed where pipes ran along the roof, dripping in rhythm. A guard pointed at the door and motioned for the women to enter. The nurses hesitated, eyes wide. For many, the memory of stories, of showers that weren't really showers, was too close, too horrifying. But this wasn't Europe. This was the Pacific, and the guards weren't shouting, they were waiting. Inside, water poured from real nozzles, clean and warm. Soap was handed out like treasure, pale, square, wrapped in thin paper with the words U.S. Army issue. One woman cried quietly as she rubbed her arms. For the first time in months, dirt ran off in black streams, revealing skin instead of grime. The air filled with the scent of something pure. Reports from the International Red Cross show that over 22 tons of hygiene goods were delivered monthly to Allied POW camps in 1945, including soap, toothpaste, and towels. But to these women, that number didn't mean anything. Numbers were abstract. What mattered was the shock of feeling human again. She stared at her reflection in a bucket of water. The face staring back wasn't a soldier of the Emperor. It was just a girl with hollow eyes and shaking hands. The shame cut deep. Why should her captors care more for her body than her own nation had? Later, as they hung their washed uniforms on a wire, an American medic passed by, grinning. "Smells like a hospital now," he joked, walking off. No mockery, no threat, just humor. Normal human humor. The nurses looked at each other, unsure whether to laugh or cry. That night she couldn't sleep. The smell of soap lingered on her hands, foreign and innocent. It reminded her of childhood baths before the war, her mother humming, steam fogging the window. For a moment, she wasn't a prisoner. She was just clean. In her notebook she wrote, "We had forgotten the smell of clean skin." And in those words lay the unspoken truth: hygiene had become mercy, and mercy had become unbearable. As dawn approached, a new kind of rumor rippled through the barracks. The Americans were handing out something else next, boxes with food inside, small, sealed and marked with 3 letters. K, ration. Morning sunlight hit the camp yard in streaks of gold and dust. On a wooden table lay a pile of small cardboard boxes, khaki, colored, printed with stenciled letters, U.S. Army K ration. The women approached slowly, cautious curiosity in every step. The guard who handed them out simply said, "Breakfast." She turned the box over in her hands. It was light but neatly packed, like something designed for another world. Inside, a can of meatloaf, a packet of gum, crackers, a Vitam. In tablet, a matchbook, and at the bottom, a bar of chocolate. The same kind she'd tasted days earlier. Her hands trembled. Was this some kind of trick, a test of obedience? But no. The Americans were already eating theirs, laughing, trading gum flavors, tearing open cans with casual strength. She took a bite of the meatloaf. Grease coated her tongue, real and heavy. The salt made her dizzy. She hadn't eaten anything this rich in months. Then came the chocolate, thicker this time, sweet but gritty, melting unevenly under the tropical heat. Her stomach, used to hunger, didn't know whether to celebrate or rebel. Tears pricked her eyes. Contemporary military data notes that each K ration delivered roughly 4 zeros, 0 calories per day, including a 2-ounce chocolate bar meant for morale. But for her, that morale meant something different. It was proof that the enemy valued energy, emotion, even joy as weapons of endurance. She whispered to a fellow nurse, "They treat food like hope." The other nodded, mouth full, too stunned to reply. In her diary that night, she confessed, "We had called them barbarians." Now, those so-called barbarians had given her warmth, sugar, and something close to dignity. For the guards, it was routine logistics. For the prisoners, it was revelation. Every calorie felt like contradiction. The Empire had taught them that suffering was sacred, yet here was proof that comfort could conquer despair. As dusk fell, she hid the chocolate wrapper under her blanket, an artifact of confusion. Outside, a truck engine sputtered to life, heading toward the supply depot. She caught a glimpse of the driver's mirror, flashing sunlight, reflecting briefly onto the barracks wall like a signal. It reminded her of letters, messages sent between worlds. And before sleep took her, she wondered, if they feed us like this, how do they speak to each other in war? With the same kindness, with the same ease. The next morning, the hum of a generator mixed with the crackle of a radio. The guards were gathered near the communications tent, listening intently. Then came the faint, stuttering voice of a news broadcast, clipped, formal English. The Japanese nurses couldn't catch the words, but they recognized the tone. Something big had happened. Later, one of the guards explained in simple terms, "Tokyo bombed again. Maybe surrender soon." She froze. Surrender? That word didn't exist in the world she'd been raised in. It was betrayal dressed as cowardice. But the guard's face wasn't gloating, it was tired, almost sympathetic. Later that day, she noticed something new. A mailbag had been delivered. American nurses, real combat medics from the Pacific Front, were sitting on the steps of the admin shack, reading letters, some crying, some laughing. One of them, a freckled woman named Clara, held up a folded sheet and smiled. "My kid brother just got his first tooth," she said to no one in particular. Then she took out a small chocolate bar and added softly, "We're sending candy home for the children in Tokyo when this ends." The Japanese nurse blinked. She thought she'd misheard. Candy for enemy children. Historical reports confirm that over 30 million letters and parcels were exchanged through the Red Cross in 1945, crossing borders and battle lines alike. But for her, this wasn't statistics, it was her entire world, fracturing in slow motion. That night, she stared at the camp radio tower blinking in the distance and wondered if her family in Yokohama was still alive. The sound of paper folding, pens scratching, and foreign laughter drifted through the camp like wind through bamboo. She could almost imagine letters moving invisibly between hearts that no longer saw each other as enemies. In her diary, she later wrote, "Their women wrote of love, not empire." It haunted her, because deep down she realized no soldier in her army had ever spoken of love as victory. As lights went out, she felt the weight of silence again. The air smelled faintly of ink and cocoa. She reached under her blanket, touching the folded ration wrapper still hidden there. Its edges were softening like memory itself. And as the night deepened, the camp dogs barked once, the signal that someone was approaching with supplies, and perhaps something more merciful. Lanterns flickered against the humid night. The supply truck had arrived again, its tires hissing over wet gravel. A few guards unloaded boxes of medical goods, bandages, gauze, morphine vials packed in straw. The Japanese nurses, now used to the routine, stood nearby waiting for instructions. But that night, something different happened. An American sergeant with dirt on his sleeves and exhaustion in his eyes stopped beside the line. He carried a can, dented and sticky from condensation, condensed milk. He hesitated, then held it out toward her. No words, just a small offering across the Gulf of War. She blinked, unsure if she was even allowed to take it. The sergeant nodded once, and when she reached out, his hand stayed steady. She remembered her training never accept enemy charity, but her body acted before her pride could intervene. The can was cold. Her fingers brushed his glove for a second, and something shifted in the air. Recognition, not victory. That night she shared the milk with two others, spooning it carefully like medicine. The sweetness was almost unbearable. It reminded them of home kitchens, of tea time before rationing, of innocence lost under air raid sirens. For a moment the war felt smaller. Records from Allied field hospitals show that over 1,200 Japanese POW were treated in U.S. run facilities across the Pacific by mid-1945, often by American medics who'd fought the same soldier. Weeks earlier, to the prisoners it was unthinkable, to the medics it was duty. She watched through the tent flap as the sergeant helped move crates into storage. The lamplight caught his face. Mud-streaked, eyes hollow, he wasn't gloating, he looked as broken as they were. She realized that mercy wasn't weakness, it was fatigue turned into decency. In her notebook she wrote later, "Why heal the defeated?" She never found the answer, only the evidence: the can, now empty, its label faded by fingerprints. That night, as the camp settled, she lay awake hearing whispers between guards. They weren't about tactics or victories. They were about home, wives, sons, the weather, small talk, human talk. She strained to catch every word, piecing together fragments of a world beyond duty. And as the generator clicked off, plunging the camp into quiet, she caught a flicker of light by the fence lanterns, maybe cigarettes. Voices low, careful, the kind of voices that carried stories when guns finally went silent. It started with a match flare. One of the guards lit a cigarette near the fence, its glow briefly painting his face in orange before the dark swallowed it again. A few meters away, two Japanese nurses sat on the ground, whispering under the watchtower's shadow. The night was thick with insects and damp heat. The air smelled of tobacco and kerosene. The guard glanced over, then did something unexpected. He tossed the cigarette toward the fence. Not close enough to threaten, just near enough for one of the women to pick it up. She hesitated, then smiled faintly and held it between her fingers, pretending to smoke. The guard laughed quietly, then lit another for himself. That was how it began. Soon, these quiet exchanges became routine. No trading, no talk of politics, just small fragments of human life passed back and forth like contraband. The nurses asked simple English words, rain, home, family. The guards replied in broken Japanese, haha, kodomo, peace. The words stumbled, but the meaning landed. In the official reports from 1945, there's a curious statistic. Over 62% of POW in Pacific camps engaged in some form of cultural or language exchange before repatriation. But statistics don't capture the warmth of those nights, the soft murmur of voices, the shared silence when a frog croaked too loud, or the tiny laugh when someone mispronounced arigato. One night she asked the young guard, barely 20 himself, what America was like. He shrugged, exhaled smoke, and said, big, cold, free. The word free hung in the air longer than the smoke. She repeated it under her breath, tasting it like a new flavor. In her journal, she wrote, we realized they also wanted to go home. It wasn't a poetic line. It was an admission of equality. The enemy wasn't faceless anymore. He missed his mother. He feared dying. He dreamed of peace. When the generator finally shut off, the night fell completely silent except for the crickets. Across the fence, someone hummed a tune, slow, sad, familiar. It wasn't Japanese. She couldn't name it, but it felt like home anyway. As the last note faded, she lay back against the earth, staring up at a sky veiled by barbed wire. Tomorrow would bring daylight, and with it, another sound she hadn't heard since before capture. Music played not for war, but for memory. The next day arrived heavy with humidity and silence until someone, somewhere, began to play. A harmonica's first note slipped through the camp like morning mist. Slow, uneven, but unmistakably human. Then came the tune, Sentimental Journey. The same song that filled American radio stations back home, now drifting through the bamboo fences of a POW camp in the Philippines. The women stopped what they were doing. One nurse dropped her bucket, another froze mid-step. The melody carried something almost sacred melancholy without mourning. A guard leaned against a post, eyes half closed, letting the notes wander across the compound. She didn't understand the lyrics, but she understood the emotion. It was homesickness, raw and quiet, and in that shared ache the enemy line blurred again, records from U.S. Army archives confirm that over 400 prisoner entertainment events were organized in Allied run camps during 1945, from film screenings to live bands. For the soldiers, it was morale maintenance. For the captives, it was shock therapy. They hadn't known music could still exist inside wire. When the harmonica paused, a voice picked up, another guard humming low. A few of the nurses joined in instinctively, wordless but on key. It became a small chorus carried by the wind, blending accents, breaking barriers. The sound made her chest tighten. Music had been banned in her field unit except for patriotic marches. Beauty in war was considered weakness. But here, surrounded by strangers, beauty was survival. She wiped her eyes before anyone noticed. The guard caught her anyway, gave a brief nod, then played louder. Around them, soldiers clapped in rhythm, laughter mixing with the song. Even the camp dogs barked in tune. In her notebook that evening, she wrote, "We wept at their music." It wasn't the melody that hurt. It was the kindness hidden in it, the reminder that emotion could live in the same world as violence. When the harmonica finally went silent, only the chirping of cicadas remained. The quiet felt heavier than gunfire. But in that hush, inspiration sparked. One nurse tore a chocolate wrapper from her pocket and began to fold it carefully, crease by crease, tiny hands shaping something delicate from scraps of sweetness. The first origami bird of the camp took flight that night, fragile wings catching lamplight proof that beauty could rise from ashes. By dawn, the origami bird had become a secret currency in the camp. The first one folded from a chocolate wrapper, sat on the nurse's bunk rail, its silver wings glinting faintly in the half-light. By the end of the day, there were dozens. Some shaped like cranes, others like stars, each made from discarded bits of foil, ration boxes, or cigarette paper. For the first time in months, their hands were doing something not commanded, not military, creation instead of obedience. The guards noticed but didn't stop them. In fact, a few began saving candy wrappers from their own rations, slipping them through the fence with a grin. The act spread quietly through the compound. Origami birds hung from tent poles, fluttering when the wind blew. The women started to draw again, 2 pencils smuggled from the supply tent. Sketches of faces, trees, home. One nurse carved a flower into a soap bar, its petals soft as breath. According to Red Cross supply manifests, art and stationery materials were included in roughly 1 out of every 10 shipments to POW camps by late 1945. To most soldiers, they were trivial comforts, but here they were rebellion disguised as beauty. Each creation was a refusal to be erased, to be remembered only as victims. They were proof of endurance. She kept one bird close to her chest, its folds now greasy from handling. "This," she whispered, "is what hope feels like." The guards watched in silence. One of them, the young one from the night talks, asked softly, "For home?" She nodded. He said, "Pretty," then walked away quickly, embarrassed by his own tenderness. In her diary that night, she wrote, "Our hands forgot how to fear." And that was true. The hands that once trembled while dressing wounds now shaped light out of scrap. But even as they built fragile beauty, the outside world was collapsing. News drifted in like smoke, Tokyo burning, armies retreating, an emperor preparing to speak. The next morning, the camp bell rang earlier than usual. Guards were tense. The radio blared static, then silence. The women froze mid-step, their paper birds trembling on wires. Something had changed, something final. Far away, in a different voice, history was about to speak. August 15, 1945. The air hung unnaturally still. Even the guards moved slower, glancing at the horizon as if expecting the sky to fall. Then, from the radio hut, a sharp burst of static cracked through the heat. Voices called out first in English, then in Japanese. Every sound inside the camp stopped. The broadcast was faint, nearly drowned in static, but the moment that voice came, the voice they had known since childhood, every woman froze. Emperor Hirohito, the sacred voice, never before heard by ordinary citizens. His tone was calm, trembling under restraint. They couldn't catch every word through the interference, but the message pierced clear enough. Surrender. The war was over. Some nurses dropped to their knees. Others stared at the ground, faces blank. A few clutched their origami birds as if they were amulets. One held a half-melted chocolate bar, the last piece from her K-ration, and realized she couldn't finish it. The sweetness now tasted like ashes. Reports confirmed that 5 million Japanese troops laid down arms after the emperor's broadcast, their obedience collapsing into silence. In camps across the Pacific, the news spread within minutes. Some cried, some laughed, others simply stared at the dirt. The American guards didn't celebrate, not loudly. They seemed just as stunned, just as tired. One guard turned off the radio, removed his helmet, and said quietly, "It's done." For her, done. Didn't feel real. The war had lasted her entire adulthood. Without it, what was left? Freedom now felt like exile. Home was gone, cities burned, family uncertain. The sound of the emperor's voice echoed in her mind, detached from victory or defeat, just finality. That night, the camp lights stayed on longer. The guards allowed extra food, maybe out of pity, maybe out of relief. The women ate in silence. No one could meet each other's eyes. In her diary, she wrote, it ended not with a bullet, but with a voice. The radio kept replaying fragments of static-laced speeches until dawn. Outside, the paper birds fluttered in the early wind, symbols of peace born from captivity. As the sun rose, the guards began preparing transport trucks. Orders had come. They were going home, or what was left of it. And as the engines roared to life, the women looked at each other, realizing the next journey might be harder than the war itself. The trucks rolled toward the harbor under a grey dawn sky. The road was silent, except for the rattle of metal canteens and the low hum of engines. Each nurse clutched a Red Cross parcel blanket, soap, a small bar of chocolate-like proof that she still existed. Ahead, the sea glimmered with ships waiting to take them back. Home, they said, but no one knew what that meant anymore. When they reached Yokohama weeks later, the docks looked less like home and more like ruin. Entire blocks flattened, ships rusting at anchor, cranes motionless like skeletons. The air smelled of salt and smoke. One of the women whispered, "We won." Another replied softly, "No one did, according to U.S. and Japanese government records over 5 million Japanese were repatriated between 1945 and 1947, many returning to cities that barely existed. Disease, hunger, and homelessness greeted them more brutally than battle ever had. As they stepped off the ship, aid workers handed out rice balls wrapped in paper. The gesture felt hollow. Too late, too little. She bit into hers anyway, because survival doesn't wait for meaning. On the walk inland, she saw children with swollen bellies chasing army trucks, mothers bowing for food, men staring blankly at the horizon where the Empire used to stand. Her boots crunched over broken glass and seashells mixed in the dust. Every sound was foreign. That night, in a repurposed schoolhouse turned relief shelter, she opened her Red Cross parcel. Inside lay that same square of chocolate, soft from the heat, smelling faintly of hope and guilt. She stared at it for a long time, then took a bite. It melted faster than before. In her journal she wrote, "The chocolate melted before we reached home." It wasn't poetry. It was fact. Sweetness couldn't survive the journey through loss. Around her, the other nurses unpacked their parcels, soap, socks, letters, small relics of captivity that somehow felt kinder than freedom. Outside, American soldiers patrolled the streets with wary faces, distributing supplies under banners that read Occupation Forces. Yet the irony struck her deep. The same uniforms that once imprisoned her were now feeding her people. She wrapped the chocolate wrapper carefully and placed it back in her parcel, sealing it like a relic. It wasn't hunger that haunted her now, it was memory, and as she looked toward the horizon, she realized peace carried its own kind of bitterness. The war had ended, but the silence afterward was crueler than the shelling. In the months that followed her return, the nurse, once a POW, now a ghost in her own city, found that Japan no longer had space for her kind of story. Neighbors whispered when she passed. Some called her Yorojiramono traitor. Others refused to look her in the eye. They didn't want to hear that the Americans had treated her kindly. They wanted martyrs, not survivors. Every time she opened her mouth to tell the truth, the words stuck in her throat. She found work at a small clinic near Tokyo, patching up malnourished children with supplies donated by the same occupation forces people cursed under their breath. The irony gnawed at her. American soap lined the shelves. American bandages wrapped the wounds of Japanese civilians. The same white cloth she once received as mercy now carried a different weight: humiliation. Historians later documented at least 27 post-war interviews in the NHK archives describing this stigma, returning POWs shunned as impure, unpatriotic, or collaborators. For women it was worse. The assumption was immediate: capture equaled shame. She kept to herself, eating quietly, working longer hours than anyone else. One evening, a fellow nurse found her washing her hands again and again until her skin bled. "Enough," the woman whispered. But she didn't stop. She said softly, "The smell won't leave." The smell of soap, once salvation, had become a reminder of captivity, of kindness that Japan refused to understand. At night, she hid her few possessions in a wooden box under the floorboards. Her POW diary, a scrap of camp blanket, and one bar of soap still wrapped in American paper. To her, it was evidence that decency had existed, if only briefly. To others, it would look like betrayal. In her final entry from 1946, she wrote, We were clean but unwanted. Outside, Tokyo was rebuilding, steel beams rising where ashes still smoked. But she couldn't shake the sense that everyone else was moving on without her. Years later, when she died quietly in her sleep, her belongings were boxed up by a granddaughter who never knew her story. Inside that box lay the forgotten proof of everything she could never say, and among the papers, one small note remained. If anyone ever finds this, remember the taste. Tokyo, 1982. A light rain tapped against the apartment window as a young woman knelt beside an old wooden chest. Inside, beneath yellowed newspapers and moth-eaten fabric, she found a small tin box wrapped in faded cloth. She opened it gently, expecting jewelry, or nothing at all. What she found instead stopped her breath. A single chocolate wrapper, crinkled, silver, still carrying faint traces of cocoa and time. Beside it, a worn notebook, pages spotted with age, words written in neat, disciplined Japanese. Her grandmother's name on the first page. The entries began in 1945, each line dated, precise. She sat by the window and read for hours, her world shrinking into those fragile pages. There were no grand speeches, no bitterness, just the quiet rhythm of survival. They fed us. One entry said, "They healed us. I did not know mercy could taste like this." The granddaughter flipped another page and found a drawing, an origami bird sketched in pencil, labeled "from chocolate." She smiled through tears. It was the same design that hung in her childhood home, folded every New Year, never explained. Now she knew why. According to Hershey Company archives, more than 24 billion chocolate bars were produced for U.S. troops during World War II, one of them just one, had reached a captured Japanese nurse in the Philippines. And through her, that single bar had crossed decades, continents, and silence to reach this moment. In the final diary entry, dated October 1946, her grandmother had written, "Sweetness survived where hatred didn't." The granddaughter closed the book slowly, hands trembling. She realized that what her grandmother had carried back from war wasn't guilt. It was proof. Proof that even inside humanity's darkest design, something small and kind could survive uncorrupted. She placed the wrapper back into the tin, sealed it, and whispered a thank you. Not to the Americans, not to history, but to a woman who had endured sweetness and shame in equal measure. Outside, the rain eased into silence. Somewhere in the city, a child laughed as a candy bar was unwrapped, the sound crisp and ordinary. The war was long over, but its quietest memory still lived, in sugar, in paper, in forgiveness no one had ever asked for. And in that small apartment, mercy tasted like chocolate again.